Pay close attention to the man in this video. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He was well-dressed, confident, successful, the kind of man people naturally trusted, the kind of man who could walk through a crowded shopping mall without attracting a second look. But behind that friendly smile was a secret so dark that it would eventually trigger one of the largest manhunts in America during the 1980s. By the time authorities discovered who he really was, multiple young women had already disappeared. Some would never return home. Others would survive long enough to tell the world what happened, and their stories would expose a predator hiding in plain sight. This is the terrifying true story of Christopher Wilder, a man who spent weeks traveling across America searching for victims, believing he was too smart to be caught. But before we get to the nationwide manhunt that made headlines across the country, we need to go back to where the nightmare truly began. March 1984. For most people, it was an ordinary spring. Families were planning vacations. Students were focused on school. Life carried on as usual. But somewhere among the crowds, Christopher Wilder was hunting. Unlike many criminals, he didn't rely on force in the beginning. He relied on trust. That was his weapon. He understood something most predators never learn. People are far more vulnerable when they believe they are safe. And so he created the perfect disguise. A successful photographer, a man connected to beauty pageants, a professional searching for new talent, to young women dreaming of careers in modeling. He seemed like an opportunity. To Christopher Wilder, they were targets. One of those targets was a 19-year-old college student named Linda. Linda was living what many would describe as a normal life. She attended university. She had a boyfriend she loved. She had plans for the future. Nothing about that day suggested her life was about to change forever. On March 20th, she visited a local shopping mall in Florida. Like thousands of other shoppers, she expected to spend a few hours browsing stores before returning home. Instead, she unknowingly crossed paths with a predator. While walking through the mall, Linda was approached by a stranger. The man introduced himself as a photographer. He complimented her appearance and suggested she had potential as a model. Linda listened politely but wasn't interested. She thanked him and continued with her day. For most people, that would have been the end of the conversation. For Christopher Wilder, it was only the beginning. As Linda left the mall and headed toward her car, she noticed the man again. At first, she dismissed it. Perhaps he was walking in the same direction. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Then she realized he was following her. A feeling of unease settled in. Moments later, her worst fears became reality. The stranger attacked. Everything happened quickly. One second she was standing beside her car. The next, her world had been turned upside down. When she regained awareness, she was no longer free. She was trapped with a man she didn't know. A man who had already begun building a trail of victims across America. Hours passed. Fear consumed her. Every decision felt like it could mean life or death. Yet even in those terrifying circumstances, Linda refused to give up hope. She watched carefully. She waited. And eventually she saw an opportunity. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she fought back. The struggle was violent. The risk was enormous. But somehow she escaped. Injured and terrified, Linda reached safety and contacted authorities. At the time, she had no idea her survival would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Because hundreds of miles away, other families were already reporting loved ones missing. As detectives reviewed Linda's statement, a disturbing picture began to emerge. This wasn't an isolated kidnapping. There were similarities to other cases. Women disappearing after encounters with a photographer. Young women vanishing after being approached in public places. Victims linked by a pattern nobody had fully recognized before. Detectives began comparing notes. The more they investigated, the more alarming the situation became. A single name appeared repeatedly: Christopher Wilder. Yet despite growing suspicion, authorities faced a major problem. They couldn't find him. He was constantly moving. One day he was in Florida. The next he was hundreds of miles away. By the time investigators followed one lead, he had already disappeared. It was like chasing a ghost. Meanwhile, Wilder continued traveling across the country, and he was already searching for his next victim. Her name was Tina, only 16 years old. Like many teenagers, she spent time with friends, worried about school, and dreamed about the future. She had no idea her life was about to intersect with one of the most dangerous criminals in America. The encounter seemed harmless at first. A friendly conversation, a confident stranger, a promise of opportunity. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing seemed threatening. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Before long, Tina found herself trapped inside a nightmare from which escape seemed impossible. For days, Wilder drove across state lines with Tina under his control. Every morning brought another highway. Every evening brought another motel room. Every passing mile took her farther from home. And throughout it all, Wilder maintained control through fear. He constantly reminded her that he was capable of violence. He repeatedly threatened her life. The message was clear: obey or die. As the days passed, Tina learned to survive. She watched. She listened. She waited. But opportunities to escape never came. Wilder was careful, experienced, always alert. At the same time, news of the growing investigation was spreading across America. Television stations began broadcasting warnings. Police departments coordinated across multiple states. The FBI joined the hunt. Yet despite their efforts, Christopher Wilder remained free. And then the situation became even worse. While traveling through Indiana, Wilder selected another victim, a young woman named Dawn. This time, he forced Tina to help him approach her. It was a horrifying situation. Tina knew exactly how dangerous the man beside her was. She understood what could happen, yet she was trapped by fear. The consequences of disobeying could be deadly. Moments later, Dawn was pulled into the nightmare as well. Now 2 young women were prisoners. 2 young women trapped, with a man who had already become the focus of a nationwide investigation. And neither knew whether they would survive the coming days. For the next several days, the nightmare continued. Christopher Wilder seemed determined to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Every morning began the same way. A long drive, a different highway, a new destination. Neither Tina nor Dawn knew where they were going next. Sometimes they crossed state lines without even realizing it. Other times they spent hours staring silently through motel windows, wondering if they would ever see their families again. The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the man holding them captive. Wilder could be calm one moment and frightening the next. That unpredictability kept both girls living in constant fear. Meanwhile, investigators across America were becoming increasingly desperate. The number of missing women connected to Wilder continued growing. Every new report added pressure. Every passing day increased the risk that another victim would disappear. Police departments from multiple states exchanged information around the clock. The FBI intensified its efforts. News stations interrupted regular programming with updates about the manhunt. His photograph appeared everywhere. His name became known across the country. Yet somehow, he continued slipping away. Back on the road, Tina noticed changes in Wilder's behavior. The confident man who once appeared completely in control was beginning to crack. He listened obsessively to news reports. He watched television whenever possible. He constantly checked his surroundings. Sometimes he seemed nervous, sometimes angry, sometimes lost in thought. For the first time, Tina sensed something important. He was afraid, not of his victims, not of the public. He was afraid of being caught. And as police pressure increased, that fear made him even more dangerous. One evening, after another long drive, Wilder checked into a motel with Tina and Dawn. The atmosphere inside the room felt different. Tense, uncomfortable, like something terrible was about to happen. Neither girl slept much that night. Both sensed the situation was becoming increasingly unstable. The next morning, Wilder packed quickly and ordered them back into the car. Hours later, he turned onto a remote road surrounded by trees. The area was isolated. There were no houses, no businesses, no passing traffic, nothing but endless forest. Tina felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong. Eventually, Wilder stopped the vehicle. He turned toward Dawn. "Get out." The words sent a chill through everyone. Dawn obeyed. She had no choice. Wilder led her away from the road and deeper into the woods. Tina remained behind, waiting, listening, praying. Minutes felt like hours. Then she heard sounds coming from the forest. A struggle, movement, then silence, complete silence. When Wilder finally returned, he was alone. Tina's heart sank. She immediately believed Dawn was dead. And if Dawn was dead, she feared she might be next. The drive that followed was one of the longest of her life. Neither spoke much. The silence inside the vehicle felt suffocating. But unknown to Wilder, his plan had failed. Dawn was still alive. Despite severe injuries and massive blood loss, she refused to surrender. Every instinct told her to keep fighting, keep moving, keep breathing. Step by step, she dragged herself toward survival. The journey was agonizing. Her body was exhausted, her vision blurred. Yet somehow she kept going. Eventually, she reached a road. Then something incredible happened. A passing driver noticed her. The driver immediately stopped and called for help. Within minutes, emergency responders were rushing toward the scene. Against all odds, Dawn had survived. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to save her life. At the same time, investigators hurried to gather information. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. Dawn described her attacker, his appearance, his behavior, the vehicle. Most importantly, she revealed that another victim was still alive. Tina. For investigators, it was the breakthrough they desperately needed. The manhunt immediately intensified. Roadblocks were established throughout several states. Additional agents were assigned to the case. Tips poured in from across the country. For the first time, law enforcement had a realistic chance of catching Christopher Wilder before another tragedy occurred. Back on the road, Wilder soon learned that Dawn had survived. The news shocked him. For weeks, he had controlled every situation. Now things were slipping beyond his control. A survivor could identify him. A survivor could help police. A survivor could bring everything crashing down. The pressure became overwhelming. Witnesses later described him as increasingly agitated and reckless during those final days. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and he knew it. Soon, television broadcasts featured his face nationwide. Families watched nervously. Communities remained on edge. Police departments stayed alert. Across America, people were searching for the same man, Christopher Wilder. The walls were closing in, and his time was running out. As the days passed, Christopher Wilder became increasingly desperate. For weeks, he had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement. Every time police got close, he disappeared. Every time investigators followed a lead, he was already somewhere else. But now, everything was changing. His photograph was appearing on television across America. His name was being mentioned in news reports. The FBI was actively searching for him. Roadblocks were appearing on major highways. And perhaps most troubling of all, one of his victims had survived. For the first time since his crime spree began, Christopher Wilder was no longer in control. Tina noticed the difference immediately. The calm, confident man she had spent days fearing was becoming unpredictable. He checked mirrors constantly. He listened to every news broadcast. He seemed distracted, nervous, paranoid. Sometimes he drove for hours without speaking. Other times he suddenly exploded in anger over minor things. It was obvious something was happening. The pressure was getting to him. And desperate people often make dangerous decisions. Tina feared she would become the victim of one of those decisions. Every day, she wondered the same thing. Would this be her last? Would she ever see her family again? Would anyone ever know what happened to her? The fear never left. It sat in the back of her mind every waking moment. Then something unexpected happened. While driving through the northeastern United States, Wilder suddenly told Tina he was going to let her go. At first, she didn't believe him. Why would a man responsible for so much violence suddenly show mercy? It didn't make sense. She assumed it was another manipulation, another trick, another way to control her. But Wilder repeated himself. He claimed he was taking her to an airport. Even then, Tina remained skeptical. After everything she had experienced, trust was impossible. Hours later, they arrived at Boston's airport. The moment felt surreal. Travelers walked through the terminal carrying luggage. Families greeted loved ones. Businessmen rushed to catch flights. Nobody around them seemed to realize they were standing next to one of the most wanted men in America. Wilder purchased a one-way ticket. Then he handed Tina money. More money than she had ever held at one time. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then he turned around and walked away. Just like that. After days of captivity. After hundreds of miles traveled. After witnessing horrors she would never forget. He simply disappeared into the crowd. Tina stood frozen. Part of her expected him to return. Part of her expected a trap. Part of her believed the nightmare wasn't over. Only after boarding the plane did she begin to accept reality. She was free. For the first time in over a week. Christopher Wilder was no longer controlling her life. When the plane finally landed in California, Tina immediately contacted authorities. Investigators had been waiting for this moment. They needed answers. and Tina had them. For hours, detectives listened carefully as she described everything she had experienced. Every motel, every road, every threat, every victim she remembered. Her information filled crucial gaps in the investigation. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies across the country continued searching for Wilder. By this point, he was one of the most hunted men in America. Officers everywhere were watching for his vehicle. Then came the breakthrough. On April 13, 1984, two state troopers in New Hampshire spotted a gold Pontiac Firebird matching the description connected to Wilder. Immediately, they became cautious. If this really was Christopher Wilder, they were dealing with an extremely dangerous suspect. The officers approached carefully. The driver remained inside the vehicle. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then suddenly, chaos erupted. A violent confrontation followed. What exactly happened in those few seconds remains debated by some investigators. But when the struggle ended, Christopher Wilder was dead. The manhunt was over. After weeks of fear, uncertainty, and violence, the fugitive who had terrorized women across America would never strike again. News of his death spread rapidly. Police departments breathed a sigh of relief. Families of victims finally received long-awaited answers. And survivors like Tina, Dawn, and Linda learned that the man who had haunted their lives was gone forever. Yet the story didn't end there. Investigators soon uncovered the true scale of Wilder's crimes. Case files were reopened. Evidence was re-examined. Victims from multiple states were linked to him. The numbers were horrifying. Behind the charming smile and professional appearance was a predator responsible for a devastating trail of suffering. Families mourned daughters who never returned home. Communities struggled to understand how one man had managed to evade capture for so long. But amid all the tragedy, three stories stood out. Linda, Dawn, and Tina each had faced unimaginable fear. Each had stared directly into the face of a killer, and each had survived. Linda's escape provided investigators with some of their earliest critical information. Dawn's incredible survival gave authorities the breakthrough they desperately needed. And Tina's testimony helped reveal the final chapter of the manhunt. Together, their courage exposed the truth. Years later, many people would remember Christopher Wilder as a serial killer, but others would remember something else: the strength of the women who refused to let him win. Because in the end, Christopher Wilder wasn't stopped by luck. He wasn't stopped by coincidence. He was stopped because his victims fought back. They survived. They spoke. And through their courage, one of the most dangerous predators of the 1980s was finally brought to justice. The nightmare had ended, but the lessons would never be forgotten.